Good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate you all for joining us for this last session when you could have gone out and probably started exploring Chicago. So kudos to you all. Thank you so much. Today we're going to be presenting on how you can build cultural competency in your classrooms, as well as how you can utilize it as a small group social skills intervention as a Tier 2 pullout group. My name is Erin Campbell. I am an assistant professor at the University of Missouri in special education and an affiliate of the Missouri PBIS Center.
Howdy, my name is Mary Rose Solis, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Erin and I met during our doctoral program. My background with PBIS started as a teacher. I was an elementary special education teacher in Missouri, and the school that I had been teaching in had been doing PBIS for a very, very long time, even before I started teaching, which was really awesome, and we got to take advantage of all of the resources within the center at Missouri. So it's wonderful to have Erin now there at Missouri.
Good morning. My name is Elise Calhoun. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Oregon, and I also consider myself a recovering special education teacher. So I'm so happy to be here to share with you all. Okay, so our learning objectives for today. Understand the meaning, we want to understand the meaning of cultural competency. It's not a bad word, not bad words. We want to understand how cultural competency helps build relationships with students to help them feel like they belong, believe their participation is valued, and also they can build the skills they need to be successful. We want to gain a better understanding of personal implicit beliefs about other cultures or identities and work to mitigate the impact of those biases on student success. Finally, we want to learn how to implement and adapt social and emotional skills as a Tier 2 intervention within a culturally responsive environment, utilizing culturally relevant pedagogy and examples.
Okay, so this is going to make sense later, but the first thing that we want you to do is, and we do want this to be a physical list. So if you have a paper in front of you, paper and pen. If you don't have that in front of you, take your computer, get into your notes app on your phone, and I want you to take some time to write down what you would identify as challenging behavior in the classroom. Obviously, get as descriptive as you can. We love our operational definitions within PBIS, but what do you consider to be challenging behavior? Maybe even think back to, if you're in school settings, what are some of those minor versus major behaviors that you have identified for your school? But we're going to give you just a little bit of time to write down a list.
So now I want to talk to you all about being culturally competent. If you're still working on your list, it's okay if you think of things and you want to keep adding to it. So virtually, being culturally competent means that you are taking the time to make sure that you, as educators or those who work with students and staff, that you have the skill set that's necessary to communicate with people who are basically from diverse cultural backgrounds. And so when we think about culture, I don't want you to just encompass culture as race. Culture also has to do with family structure. Culture has to do with the environments or the spaces that your schools or districts employ within the family structure. Virtually, if you work in a Catholic school, the culture of your environment could be people who come from Catholic backgrounds and those who don't. When you're working in the public school setting, if you're in a more urban district, I want you to consider culture as two-parent household families. It may be a one-parent household. That's a part of the culture. The children or students could stay with a caregiver or grandparent. They could be in foster care. All of those things are encompassed in culture. And then we also need to be considerate of LGBTQ plus communities and the families that they bring into our schools as a part of culture as well. So being culturally competent can allow you to respect as well as appreciate the diversity that your students and your colleagues bring into your school. And it can also help you bridge cultural gaps and different tension points that can take place within your meetings and in your classroom settings.
So we're going to talk about the 3 components of cultural competence. When I think about a competency, I am a person that's heavily involved in teacher preparation, but also several state grants in the state of Alabama where we look at the competencies of educators and developing those competencies. One of the things that maybe when I think about the term competency, maybe you think that once you have that competency, that now you're culturally competent, right? So I have mastered this competency, and now it's just like riding a bike and I can always do that. But that's not the case with many of the other competencies that we look at in education that I initially prepare my pre-service teachers to have, but then they need to continue to develop that skill and sustain that skill when they're in the schools. And so when we think about cultural competency or cultural competence, these are daily activities that you are doing on a regular basis in order to remain culturally competent. Now, so we look at these 3 components. The first one is cognitive, so that we are actively on a daily basis, on a regular basis, seeking out reading, talking with other people, seeking out that knowledge about different cultures, worldviews, belief systems, history, traditions, practices, and language. So I'm doing this on a regular basis and seeking out growth opportunities that will give me this knowledge. There's a funny story that just happened that I wanted to talk about. So my colleague, Dr. Campbell, is really kind, and she had gotten me a coffee this morning, which was just so kind. I got down, I really needed the coffee. And so I was about to go up to get something to eat, and she said, hey, if they have ginger ale, get ginger ale. If they don't, get Coke Zero. And so I went up there, the first ginger ale that I saw, I grabbed it, and I brought it back. What I had no idea, okay, we're having somebody over here automatically tell me, I had never even thought about it was Seagram's. Do you now understand where I'm going with this? I have never really thought about ginger ale. I like ginger ale on the plain, but it's not something I think about regularly. So I brought back and I give the Seagram's, and I can kind of see her being like, oh, no. So why? Why was that something?
So when she gave me the Seagram's ginger ale, of course I thanked her for it and told her I appreciate this drink. I said, but just so you know, as like a cultural thing, Black folks only like Canada Dry. Seagram's doesn't have enough sugar in it. It's not made with cane sugar. It's not sweet enough. We don't really like it. And so Elise shared in my sentiment, and there was another a Black young lady sitting beside us who we do not know. And I said, excuse me, I just want you to chime in here. This is a ginger ale she bought me. Like, what do you think? And she said, it's not Canada Dry. And I was like, see?
So this is something that I honestly had no idea, had never even thought about, but this is one of those situations that we need to be, and thankfully I have a colleague that would tell me that, and this is an opportunity for me to grow in the knowledge about other people's cultures. And are we regularly putting ourselves in situations where there's an opportunity for that, right? And so the next part is we look at the affective, and that's developing empathy for individuals from different cultures by recognizing and respecting their perspectives, but this is the most important part, without imposing our personal beliefs. So are we having conversations where we are able to have empathy for their perspective without feeling the need to impose my beliefs on that person? And the third, I really see this as, okay, I'm gonna seek knowledge, I'm gonna have empathy and understanding and not try to impose my beliefs, but there needs to be regular behavioral actions, those behaviors on a regular basis. We're behavior people, so we know that. And that's changing communication style based on context, showing interest in what others have to say, being aware of power dynamics. So those are those actionable steps on a daily basis that are informed by our cognitive aspect and seeking that knowledge. So the next one we wanted to offer, and again, our slides are up on the website as well as in the app. And when we were at the Equity Strand, where we had that amazing school leader from Pennsylvania, from the Philadelphia, I almost said Philly, but then added it with Philadelphia, the Philly Public Schools, and they were talking about the importance of organizational support for this cultural competence model. And so we can do our personal work in critical awareness and knowledge and go to that cognitive aspect and really increase our knowledge, and we can develop those skills in the classroom, but if we don't have that organizational support that a PBIS structure can offer us, then we're not gonna have that full circle and making sure that that's implemented on a regular basis. And so just the importance of that PBIS structure to support that knowledge and that skill development.
So now we want to talk a little bit about like how we can understand different communication styles. So virtually in saying cultural competence involves appreciating differences in communication styles across different cultures. So the first thing you want to do as like a teacher or educator or those interacting with your colleagues or your students, you kind of want to take a survey or an assessment of how you see those students engaging with each other when they're trying to gain each other's attention. You want to look at and see how your colleagues interact with each other, like just a little bit of observations. And it's really important to watch how these students facilitate conversations with their parents or their caregivers as they like enter your rooms for meet the teacher night, back to school night, or even if you gain any insight to what's going on in their homes. And virtually you want to do this so that if you are a teacher who is thinking of, okay, when I call someone's name, I expect them to acknowledge me with eye contact. Is that something that you see them doing on a regular basis when others acknowledge them? Do they do it when their friends call out to them to look at, do they look back at them in the eyes? When other administrators make contact with that student, do they look at them? Do they look down? Do they look past them? Do they just say a verbal like yes or yes ma'am or even a what, which is a little bit inappropriate, but we can work on that too. But just looking and seeing like how they communicate. And then once you get an assessment of that, if in your classroom or in your school you want the culture to be when an adult sanctions or calls out your name, we'd like you to make eye contact so we can know that you're listening and that you've heard us, then you know that that's a cultural establishment that you want to make with those students, and you want to teach them that expectation instead of just assuming that they should know, if I call on you, you should know that you should look at me as the adult in the room. Don't just make that assumption. The other thing that's important to do is perhaps consider in surveys that you send home or even when you talk to families, if they make their ways into the classroom, just talk to them about like you want to kind of understand what it's like at home and how they communicate with their child or the child that they're caregiving for, and what are the requirements like. Most importantly, has that child ever heard the word no or not right now? Or wait. So if they indicate to you like, no, those really aren't things that we say like at home, I'm working on that, then you'll also know that you need to teach patience, which is going to take time in those first 6 to 8 weeks of school, which is when we see a large number of office disciplinary referrals. And the other thing that I want to make note here is direct communication is really valued in communities of color. And so a lot of us as educators and admin, we write home about the things that are issues or challenging in our classrooms, in our schools, but we don't always write home enough about things that the students are making progress in, things that they're doing well. And so that can sometimes sever that opportunity for a parental or caregiver relationship with you to help in partnership with that student and with that family. So if that family can feel that you also are encouraging and seeing some of the things that that particular child is doing correctly or is doing well, even if it's something as simple as, hey, when they entered the classroom, they greeted me with such a warm smile and attitude this morning. I was really pleased with that. If that's how we have to start out, that's great. But don't make everything a negative interaction, because for us to have a positive classroom environment and to be able to communicate with our students, it helps if we have a positive communication relationship with their parent or their caregiver. And then we also want to make sure that we're embracing diversity in our rooms. So how many of you, like, as you set up your classroom or you watch, like, how your school is set up and you're looking at the different bulletin boards and things that parents or students see when they enter, how many of you feel like you're in a diverse, inclusive space? Okay. What are some of the things, for those of you who raised your hand, that you feel like you're in a diverse, inclusive space? What is it that your building or your classroom looks like, if you don't mind sharing? Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, it's important for students exactly to see themselves in books that they're reading, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. Does anyone else have any differing things that are encompassed in their building or classroom? Okay, so based on that number of hands, we're going to talk to you about some ways that you can think about how you can embrace diversity within your classroom and within your school that are not costly. They're just simple adjustments and things that you can do for students. But it's really important, when you survey your class, that if you have a student in the room, so for me, I'll just give a personal example. I grew up in a school where I was the only black student. There was like 3 in the whole school, and then virtually one of us in like a few classes. And so initially I had to deal with teachers having some implicit bias, which we'll discuss about whether or not maybe I was gonna be a little bit of an issue of a kid. I also dealt with possibly feeling like out of place, like maybe not wanting to answer questions even though I was smart, because if I said the wrong thing, I didn't want to feel ostracized. And then a lot of the books and the conversations that we read, I didn't really see myself or my family or my culture through those lessons or through those views. And even in courses like math, I preferred, even though I understood it, to use manipulatives or be able to get up and work in partner groups and do stations because that style of learning was just more conducive to what I found natural and what I liked. But I was in a more like structured, like row seating, structured environment. And so it just really felt like I was out of place. Like I virtually got all of my belonging in out of school activities. And so us as educators, we don't want our students to feel like they need to outsource the things that we could give them in school. So like, we'll talk about how as you do your lesson plan and you're thinking about read aloud books that you want to encompass, the way you might teach math, the way you might be going about science, posters that you hang in your room, picking students with disabilities to be pictured, picking diverse student groupings or pictures that you see, or if you don't want to use race or gender as something in your room, maybe using more characters, like fictional characters or animals, so no one doesn't feel like, belong, like they don't belong, if that makes sense. Oh, is that mine too? Oh, sure.
And one of the things about embracing diversity and seeing that as a strength, this is a little bit of a scenario, and I had talked with Dr. Campbell about that this morning, is that I live in downtown Birmingham, and one of the things that's this weekend that I'm really excited to get back for is the Magic City Classic. There's always a lot of events that happen in Birmingham for the Magic City Classic, and it's a really well-known and one of the largest football games that's celebrated within the city for HBCUs. And it's really important to the different communities in Alabama that they attend and support this football game. And I saw somebody that was on Twitter and they were complaining and saying that it was not a good thing that the schools had built into their calendar that they had today off so they purposely take today off in order for everyone to come to Birmingham to celebrate this game that's really important for them. And this is a situation where this is something that's really important for their culture. And the school is going to have the same number of days. They have a calendar. There's so many days that they have to have according to the state. But this is an opportunity for them to celebrate something that's really important for them and not really something maybe that we need to complain about that there's not school today. But also when we think about cultural competence and what Dr. Campbell said of not just thinking about this in terms of race, that we're also thinking about it in terms of belief systems. So cultural competence means respecting others' religious beliefs and spiritual practices, even if they differ from your own. That's probably the most important part. This requires respect for pluralism and maturity to see past the differences. So for instance, when I was a teacher, and this is something, I grew up here in the Chicago suburbs, and I taught in rural Missouri, and it had a really strong Christian foundation, even within some of the schools that that wasn't something that I was used to. And so a lot of my students, what was really important was Wednesday night church. And they were going to Wednesday night church. They were excited for Wednesdays. That's something that they wanted to talk about with me. That's not something that I grew up in. That's not something that I do now. But it was important to my students. And so it's something that they want to talk about. And it was important that I talked about that with them. And I was excited for them with that.
And the other thing we want to mention is identifying any unconscious biases that we may have in the classroom. So those are outside of our awareness, and we can work on identifying them through self-reflection and constantly like scanning ourselves, checking others on decreasing those biases and discriminatory practices. And then we want to work to build cross-cultural relationships. So virtually understanding it's possible that everything that your school needs might not already be existing in your school building. So working to reach out to those community partners. So for those of you in like title schools or working in more urban settings, it's really important to see where the students are taking their buy-in and their leadership from. Like, is it coming from people running a certain community center outside of your school campus? Is it coming from a potential like gang involvement or something around your school? So once you can survey like where buy-in is and kind of what's important to the students, then you can figure out like who you need to get as a potential stakeholder within your school's action team. And so sometimes it's important to bring in a local church pastor if that's where like the parents or their grandparents pretty much expect them to be on Sunday mornings. It may be important to bring in some coaches that are outside of your school campus to be a part of that team so that they can talk to the students. You can take initiatives from them and see what it is they feel like the students need more of or what they're looking for so that you guys can have a conducive learning environment. So just being open to having some outside constituents and consultants as a part of your teams.
So I think you all are here and you know the answer of why continue cultural competence and you think that it's important. But obviously we live in a diverse and fast-paced world, and most of the schools we're seeing increased numbers of diversity within your schools. But you believe that this is something that's important, but when you're continuing this message to the teachers and the staff that you serve, one of the things that is so incredibly important and that we know from education from a really long time in the research is that they always tell us we have to have really strong relationships with our students, and that teacher-student relationship is one of the greatest predictors of success of that student, right? We've heard this over and over and over again about teacher-student relationships. In order for you to have strong teacher-student relationships with a diverse population is that you have to have that cultural competence. And that's so important in order for us to see those outcomes and for that student to feel seen and heard in their school.
And that means we have to work to keep them in the classroom with you as the teachers. So it's important and I'm sure this was talked about in the previous presentation, so sorry if I'm overlapping it, but it's important as teachers and admin that we don't allow students to realize that if they act out or if they make their teacher uncomfortable, they can escape being around that individual like for the remainder of the day or for the remainder of that period, because that can become an escape maintained behavior. But it's important as the teacher, if you're willing, to see what is it about this subject area or about me or an interaction that I could have previously had with this student or even another student that has spoken to them that's caused them to just want to get out of whatever it is that I'm implementing or instructing ever or at this particular time of day. So as Dr. Estrapola was saying in the previous session, really understanding the function of the behavior is really important. And we'll talk about it on a few slides ahead of time when we get to our research. But just a little bit about it. When it comes to check in, check out, in cultural competence. What we've discussed, myself and some of the studies that we'll talk about, is using the teacher as the implementer, so that you don't feel left out of that reward cycle with that student as they learn to build those skills so that they can be successful in your classroom. You're actually a part of intervening and changing that. But through that culturally responsive check in, check out, the teacher and the student can begin to share and build relationship. You can understand what mindset the student is entering your room in. So instead of just checking in with them about what they have for the day, if they know what's the normal expectations of them, actually asking them, like, how was your night? Is there anything that you need at this moment so that you can be successful today? It could be as simple as, like, I need a warm embrace, because there's plenty of research that shows, like, we need 8 hugs a day to feel warm, loved, and effective. And so it's possible that the students may need some of those from you as their teachers. But like I said, we'll talk about that. And then we want to make sure we understand our implicit biases. So these are unconscious racial or socioeconomic biases that we may have. So this could be in regards to, like, attitudes, stereotypes, making sure that you're not hypervigilant regarding certain groups of students' behaviors within your classroom, things of that nature. And Elise has something she'd like to share.
Thank you. So I don't know how many educators we have in the room, but for me personally, teaching was the most on-the-job training experience that I've ever had. So one of the things I wanted to point out, as an educator, I did, for myself, reflecting and thinking about the things that I did, having socioeconomic bias. So I predominantly taught in under-resourced communities, Title I schools. And so in the beginning, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know how this is going to work for me. I come from an upper middle class background, and my students didn't share that same experience. So my first thought was like, ooh, this is not gonna work, I need to flee, I have to go. But I had to understand what was going on and what my classroom would be like, but I was very nervous as a new teacher. And so one of the things I wanted to mention, as we talked about earlier in involving students in the classroom, I had a student from Mexico, and I spoke with the family, and they shared with me that they spoke very little English, but they wanted their child to speak more English in the classroom. So I was like pumped. I was like, okay, great. I get my the document we have for IEPs. I'm gonna make sure I have the translations. I'm gonna make sure I have a translator in the IEP meeting if I can. That never worked out. I had to find somebody else. But during last year, in taking a diversity and special education course, self-reflecting, and it hit me. The whole time I had this student in my class, at no point did I ever have a book in Spanish? Did I ever have any words on the wall in Spanish? Did I ever create a worksheet for him that had Spanish to English translations? It did not exist. And I'm a couple years removed from the classroom, and it just happened to me last year. I'm like, oh my gosh, I totally missed it. So just thinking about those things and, making sure sometimes it takes more than having a book or a translation or something like that, but just reflecting as soon as you can. And sometimes it doesn't happen every day, and we'll talk about self-reflection in a few slides, but that was an eye-opening experience for me.
Thank you so much for sharing, Elise. This your slide. Okay. And then this is just furthering about why we should continue cultural competence, but we're going to keep it going. These are some examples of implicit bias in the classroom. So as an educator, you may assume that students know how to ask for help, Sometimes it's nice to instrument like a help system. Some of the things that I've mentioned with schools that I work with lately is a cup system. So having a red and a green cup. And so if there's some students who feel some shame in raising their hand or calling you out to come over and assist them, if they need help, they can put the red cup up. And then if they feel like they're doing well and they don't need any help, then they could have the green cup. So those are just one of the strategies that I've mentioned. Another thing is assuming that students who are multilingual might be poor readers or writers. Students with limited writing skills may have an intellectual disability. So these are just a list of a few of the implicit biases that have been more common. And then so Elise touched on this, but just reflecting on your teaching. And so we're not saying that you need to keep a daily journal or a consistent journal of writing everything that's happened in your classroom. But maybe if you do a particular lesson with your students, or you as an admin observe a certain lesson or interaction, just taking some time if you notice that maybe the students weren't really engaged during the lesson, reflecting about all the ways that could be that aren't necessarily related just to the academic content. Just thinking about what could be some other factors that cause the students to not be engaged or cause them to not want to respond to questions or things of that nature. So just maybe doing that on 1 or 2 lessons a week sometimes can help you reflect, realize in any ways where you think you're being completely culturally competent or aware of your students' needs, where you may have missed the mark. As Elise shared, it took her a couple of years. So hopefully it won't take all of us that long. But love you. And so, right. And then here are some strategies for an inclusive classroom environment. So you want to use multiple and diverse examples. So you can think about this even in the construction of like your word problems that you give in math. Like, don't make all the word problems about like mom and dad taking someone to the store and spending $500 on an Xbox. It's possible that your students can get caught up in, well, I want an Xbox One, and my mama said that I'm not getting it to blah, blah, this and blah, blah, that, and they've missed the whole point that, I just want you to add these numbers up and tell me like how much money this is. So just thinking about some of the words that you're putting in your word problems, family structures that you're using, try to diversify those. As you're thinking about literature that you choose for your class, if you have students that are inclusion in your room or with disabilities in your room, maybe doing some read alouds that have characters that are, will make them feel included, or have the students have an understanding toward that student and sort of more of an understanding, less questioning, less pointing at that student if it's a visible disability. The other thing is using small groups to encourage competitive ways of learning. So just the way that you can arrange your groups. I know in a lot of schools they're working to do a lot of pairing with students who maybe are a little bit more advanced than others at the table to see how they can use some of that peer support to support their learning. But it's potentially reflective and helpful. Like if you have students in your room with disabilities, allow them to interact with each of your table groups. Give them all an opportunity to work with this student. Don't always have one particular group of students working with the students of color in your room. Give them all time to engage and form their own perspectives and belief systems around each other so that they can develop a better understanding and possibly a more inclusive classroom environment. And then this is really important. All of us can say that we are concerned about being culturally competent or being anti-racist in our practices. However, if we observe these instances and remain silent, that is just as hurtful as the person who made the offense. So finding ways to politely call out your colleagues if you've noticed that they've done something that could be potentially harmful to your students or to other colleagues on your school campus or within your district, making sure that you address it. You will gain respect from other colleagues. It will definitely help students in your classroom feel more protected and safe within that environment, as well as being comfortable to challenge students. So students who engage in bullying and they are being discriminatory or offensive or racist in their comments or remarks toward any group, making sure you address it as a teacher and don't just silently ignore it, that you hear it off to the side. And I know that's easier said than done, but if students can see that you won't tolerate it, at least in your room, that could be the first change that's made. And if others begin to show that they won't tolerate a student being disrespectful to student because of sexual orientation, gender, disability, ability, race, hair, any of those things, then we can start to clean that up classroom by classroom. And then the other thing that you can do to make your classroom feel more inclusive is having a post-it diversity statement within your room that's explicitly posted and that you agree to teach. Just like you teach your rules and your expectations the first 6 to 8 weeks of school, teach the diversity statement for your room and review it often. And so I put a sample one in here for you that you could use or adapt. So having your students understand, I put our, but if you're the teacher in that room, you'd be like, it is my hope that students from all diverse backgrounds and perspectives be well served by this classroom, that students' learning needs be addressed both in and out of class, and that the diversity students bring to this classroom can be viewed as a resource, a strength, and a benefit. So that is something that you could begin to instill in your students or within your admin, and that lets all your students know that regardless of how they're entering your room with whatever baggage, with whatever family structure they come from, regardless of their color, that this is a space that they're accepted in and they can feel safe in, and everything that they bring to your room, we can somehow find it as a benefit and something that we can learn from and share with others. So now we want you to go back to that list that you wrote at the beginning, and if you're willing to share, can any of you see how anything you wrote on your list may reveal any bias that you could have had? This is a safe space. Oh, okay, thank you.
Skipping class, and immediately I thought a lot of times that's a transportation responsibility of a family.
Uh-huh.
So considering that it's not, a lot of times it's not a student choice.
Thank you. Any others? Yes.
I put skipping class as well, but I think that our students skip class because our teachers are not engaging them in content that's relative to who they are.
Okay. Okay. I saw a hand here. Did you raise your hand? Yeah. No, go ahead. Share, share.
I have profanity on mine. I'm not a classroom teacher, I'm an assistant principal.
Uh-huh.
And it's a challenging behavior, but I think it's more so like teachable opportunities or teaching opportunities because students are, from my observation, are struggling with
How to communicate.
how they speak in the presence of their peers versus how they speak in the presence of adults. And I'm from an era where you just knew not to curse in front of your teachers or opponents. And I think it's like a shift
Right.
age-wise, a generation that's happening. So I have it on here, but I think it's more so like a teaching of these things that needs to.
No. So cursing can be a challenge in the classroom if it's distracting to students because it can ramp other students up, especially depending upon the context, if it's funny, like what happened. So I think you bring up a good point about how we need to think about the students that we're teaching, and if we need to talk about code switching, like, hey, if that's how you talk with your friends outside of school, if that's cool with your mom, your dad, your caregivers, that's fine. But in this room, we're going to use, kind words, or we're not going to use profanity in this room. In this room, if you want to initiate a joke or you want to say something funny, like maybe you can come up with a list of words you'll accept, like, oh, that's on fleek, or that's, like just certain terminology that's okay for you to use, or that's not profanity, but can give them that same sort of comfort in knowing they can be comfortable in your room. So maybe discussing, like, these are some slang terms that are appropriate that you can use in my room, but that doesn't mean that you can use it in such and such's room. You have to talk to them about what the environment is like there. And then that can kind of let the students know that you're still a person, you still have fun, you're still with the times, type of thing. So I think you bring up a good point in that.
And to add on to that, one of the things that's important is that I don't know if I always did this perfectly as a teacher. I think I tried, but is that when I'm talking with them, is that if their parents do allow them to swear at home, that the connotation that I took when I talked about it, because I have heard sometimes where people say, well, your parents shouldn't let you do that. And that's where I'm imposing my parenting beliefs or my beliefs when that's not necessarily their beliefs and their family. So making sure that the way that we're addressing that is in a neutral tone and not imposing my beliefs on somebody else.
Conversation I've been having to have with teachers, because that's been a response, like where your mom or your dad may let you speak like that, and I'm like, that's not necessarily true. They may not
Absolutely.
agree with you, so.
Yes.
Yes.
I think she had a question first, and I'll go after her.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Was it you?
I just wanted to add to that. I think it's one of the when kids walk into our school, it is a different culture. They have a home culture, and then they have our school culture, and they don't match up. They just don't a lot of times. And so I was like, I love how you say that. It's like how I spoke. I had the exact same thing. I had the privilege of finding out that that's like I'm just talking like my dad talks. And does that mean my dad's a bad person? Because this was a real little, right? Real person. No, your dad's not a bad person, right? Like making sure that we're not putting undue pressure on these kids with our own bias about how they're speaking, how they're having a conversation.
Yeah.
So thank you for this presentation. It's really awesome. And you threw that beautiful lady under the bus. I'm kidding. That was a funny joke. One of the things that I've noticed when I'm out in my schools is, and most of the primary language besides English that's spoken is Spanish. And what I'm shocked at is that the teachers are not trying to learn even greetings. And Spanish is one of the, if you don't know Spanish, it's one of the easiest languages to learn. And my schools have like, over 100 languages, so it's hard to learn all of them. But if we could try, now here's what I say to my teachers. Do you go to the bathroom? And I say, yeah. I said, do you ever take your phone into the bathroom? And they're like, yeah, especially the men, right? And so then I say, Duolingo is free app, and you can learn greetings really quickly. So I think what we're not actually doing it like the basics is what I'm seeing. We're not even doing the basics to try to connect with our children in schools. And it just anyway. So thank you for this presentation.
I just wanted to add an experience with cultural competence. I'm from Georgia, and so we do things a certain way in the South. And living in Eugene, Oregon, I have an 8-year-old son, and at his school, none of the teachers allow for the students to call them by their first names. No Mr., no Miss, no nothing. And so, so he came home and he's like, Eric did such and such, and Eric da-da-da-da-da. And I'm like, who's Eric? My teacher. I said, why are you calling him Eric? And I flinch and cringe every time. But the culture there is, no pronouns, but also the teachers feel that, and some adults may feel this way, that on a scale, adults and children are kind of the same. And so I'm having a hard time making that adjustment, but I tell my son, in this house, we're doing ma'am, no sir, no ma'am, because if I take you back home to my parents and you're talking about, yeah, no, mom, like Elise, it was a lot. But it's just, I have to think about those things as well, so yes.
And then the last point we wanted to make on culturally responsive is as you meet those students the first 6 to 8 weeks of school, thinking about the rules or expectations that you place on them, maybe allowing them to be a part of the process and talking to you about how they would see their classroom environment. What are some things that they want to see? What are expectations that they have? And you guys build your class rules and your expectations together. And then you model and you practice those rules together, for a few weeks. So by the time we roll around to week 4, and you have to hold, Zach accountable because Zach is at carpet time, like making a lot of noise, not focused on what you're doing. You can be like, Zach, as a class, we decided when we're on the carpet, we'll raise our hand and let Mr. or Mrs. such and such know that we want to say something or that we want to give feedback. And you are not following that expectation that you and your classmates set. So that means X. So that way when you're holding accountable, you know that they know what the expectation is, you know that they know what the rule is, and they already know the consequence because you guys have talked about it. And most importantly, they know how to sit still and do well on the carpet because you taught them and you practiced. So when you hold them accountable, you're not making any assumptions as to what they ought to know. And then this is just a QR code that you can use if you'd like. It's a very nice culturally responsive classroom checklist, a really quick checklist that you can take a survey of your classroom or different classrooms in your district to see if they're culturally responsive. Okay, we're gonna move toward the social skills for time. Okay, so now we're gonna talk about Tier 2 social skills instruction with cultural adaptations.
So we wanted to spend a large portion of the time talking about cultural competence, especially when we talk about social skills. So social skills and that cultural competence really go hand in hand in making sure that you have that foundation. And so social skills falls under the practices, of course, or set in the stage. But it's important to think about those core features of Tier 2 interventions. Oftentimes when we think about Tier 2 interventions, people like to go straight to specific interventions instead of thinking about the features of Tier 2. We are so focused in, and I can tell you, when I was a teacher, we would think of Tier 2 interventions in terms of specific interventions, like check in, check out, or social skills, rather than thinking about what are the features that need to be included in that Tier 2 intervention. And so you'll notice that related to Tier 2 interventions, we want them to be function-based, which I know that the previous presentation talked about, but that aspect of customizable to student need. And that's where that cultural competence comes in, is that we need to make sure that we have those cultural adaptations for this intervention in order to customize it to what they need. And again, when we go back to those key Tier 2 practices, we see that increased instruction and practice with self-regulation and social skills are one of the key practices of Tier 2. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between adaptations versus using standard protocols. Oftentimes what you see within the PBIS resources are the standard protocols for certain interventions, such as check in, check out that they talked about earlier. And so there are benefits to doing a standardized protocol. And that first benefit is that they are limited teacher planning. Maybe there are really amazing resources out there, and so you're not requiring that teacher to put in the extra planning. It may help to ensure treatment integrity, just making sure that we're doing it as it was researched to make sure that we're getting that effect. And so I think sometimes we're nervous to make those adaptations because we want to make sure that we are doing it in a way that it was studied, so it's an evidence-based practice. But there are disadvantages to that. And that disadvantage is that it may not directly align with student need. Is that the standardized protocol, and what we know from the research is that quite a bit of research is done with white, middle-class neighborhoods that surround universities, right? And so it's possible that the research that's been done with the standardized protocol was not reflective of the community that we're about to use this with. And so it's really important that because of that major disadvantage, this may not be reflective of what that student needs. And so that's when we start to think about adaptations to the standard protocol. And so there are really two different types of adaptations that we look at with an intervention. And so the first one is the one that we're going to talk about, and that are horizontal adaptations. And these are adaptations made before the start of the intervention to increase effectiveness. And we're thinking about those student factors. And that's what we're talking about. And the cultural adaptations are the student factors and contextual factors for the community that you are teaching in. But the vertical adaptations are done after you start the intervention based on kind of what you're seeing that that student needs. So then we're going to go into social skills instruction and how this applies. So a lot of times people assume that because now we're SEL, so social emotional learning means that like social skills is thrown out, which we see that social emotional learning, when we think about those 5 core competencies that Castle has identified, is that social skills falls under social emotional learning. We see social awareness and relationships. Now, I would argue that the other ones also go along with social skills, but when we look at specifically relationships and social awareness, that directly aligns with the social skills instruction that we're doing. Did you want to?
Yeah, and then there's an additional point I want to make about this slide. So these are the core competencies, like she said, that Castle developed. But through my work, we've also noticed that Black students in particular, because my work focuses mostly on Black students who are at risk for emotional and behavioral disorders, and how we can help them be more successfully academically and with their behavior. We've noticed that these 5 components are not encompassing of everything that they need. So one of the things that needs to be added, and we'll talk about as an adaptation, is what authority members of our community and in our schools that we need to show respect to, and what respect for authority looks like. And so that is one of the components that is missing from this circle, because if students are not able to respect you as a teacher or administrator in their building, or even as a resource officer, there's no way that we can look at teaching them social awareness, self-management, or even teaching them anything academically, because the lack of respect and care is wreaking havoc in our classroom and in our schools. So that's one of the things that needs to be added. And it's really important to encompass that community member that I spoke about earlier, like who is it in that community, or what is it in that community that students or families really look up to or find their peace or belonging with, so that you can include them as a stakeholder or as a partner in your district or your school campus. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and talk about the adaptations. So one of the things we can do as we think about explicit instruction and target skills, using role models from older grades has been really effective with students of color. So if they're in 3rd grade, maybe having a peer mentor in the 5th grade that can hold them accountable for doing the expectations and things that they're struggling with at their current classroom level has been seen as helpful. Making sure to, as this young lady mentioned, maybe students are skipping class because teachers aren't engaging them or they don't feel like they belong. Making sure that in your planning and the ways that you teach your lesson that you're using examples or students or characters that are reflective of the students in your room. When it comes to modeling, make sure that you even look to current events locally and nationally. So in one of my studies that we're going to give you a QR code to download, it took place in Texas, and it was during the time where Sandra Bland's events were really being discussed nationally, but specifically it was a large focus on it in Texas because it's in Waller County where it took place. And so just taking the time to talk to it through the event with your students, hear their understanding of the event. Not saying when you're listening or you're hearing that you're supposed to inflict what should have happened or what made this happen or what made that happen, but just giving them a space to feel vulnerable and talk to you about it. So it's okay to be culturally responsive and listen without responding and, giving your personal beliefs and opinions through that, but allowing them to know they don't have to whisper about it all while you're teaching or scrolling on their phone, that you can talk about it in the classroom as a whole in a respectful manner. So that way they can get that out, and then you can get on with what it is that you want to talk to them about. So it's okay to do those things. It's okay to mention the VMAs. If you know your kids were up late and they watched the Video Music Awards and they're talking about what happened at the BET Awards, instead of letting them do that on your time, be like, oh, I hear you guys talking about what happened. Oh, what were some of your favorite events that you saw on TV last night that are appropriate to share in the room? And just letting them get that little chatter out, and then you can move on with your lesson. The other thing is role play is really important. So making sure your students really know what your expectations and behaviors look like, not assuming they know how to be in listening and learning position, but teaching them that means maybe voice at a 0, voice at a 1, having supplies, things of that nature. And then teacher feedback is really important. So sometimes we can struggle with giving that positive praise, but making sure that you do take the space for every disciplinary correction that you have to give 2 positive praises throughout your room every time that you do that, just to keep a positive pro-social environment. And then just encourage your students to engage in those positive behaviors in other classrooms, and maybe give them some sort of reward. Like maybe if you get 10 compliments over the course of a certain amount of time, they earn X reward, your class, like from specials or other teachers that may have interactions with them. And then these were the QR codes that you can get from your app to download the studies that specifically talk about how we use the Strong Start intervention and what cultural adaptations we made to it, as the curriculum wasn't currently culturally responsive, and just some of the other things you can do in your room with existing social, emotional, or pro-social behavior curricula to help your students. And then I also listed some of the books that we chose as a different cultural adaptation for the books in the Strong Start curriculum here throughout the PowerPoint, so you're free to look at those. And at least for some of you, we gave you a cultural competence assessment. That's something that you can take back to use in your district or with other teachers that you work with, just kind of evaluating what culturally responsive training you had, maybe as a pre-service teacher, or you've gotten since you've started teaching, and you can talk to your district about what your additional needs are to help you and others. And then if you're interested in pursuing your doctorate, shameless plug here, we do have a leadership grant. Send myself or Dr. Chad Rose an email if you're interested in earning your PhD for free with a stipend, and come to Mizzou. Okay. And then we'll stick around for questions since we've run out of time. So feel free to come up or email us or reach out to myself or Dr. Solis on Twitter. Thank you all so much for your time. Elise has additional handouts up here.